PDF file. So I'll tell you as we scroll down, but I won't screen share because that also seems to make the connection not as good. Yeah, so let's start, Shanti, with the morning prayers if we can. Do we have those to load up? Okay. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Zugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate and make offerings and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme amongst humans, you were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides, then said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I prostrate. With pure bodies formed supremely pure, wisdom motion like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, to you, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not, incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Savior, having great compassion, the founder, having all understanding, the field of merit with the qualities like a vast ocean, to be one the dust is my prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms. The one path is the blind pure reality. To the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and also show the path to liberation. The holy mind, holy field qualities of the realizations. To you who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all 3 ever devout homage. To all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all of realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a vision, elaboration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. To these merits may all sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the full faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. I prostrate to the Arya triple gem, thus did I hear at one time. The Bhagavan was dwelling in a massive Vulture's mountain, in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks, a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the countless aspects of phenomena called profound illumination. Also at that time, the Venerable Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice as a profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, perfectly and correctly and repeatedly beholding the 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Next slide, Santi. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also none other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased. Stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element and so up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell on the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obstruction, without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the endpoint of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awakened to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment and reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering should be known as the truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata hum gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhi soham. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, to train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bodhisattva, the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commanded the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Aryabhalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage, it is like that, it is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even that Haratagaras will rejoice. The Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venerable Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Aryabhalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, with humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. I prostrate to the gathering of Dakinis in the three chakras who abide in the holy yoga of using space. By your powers of clairvoyance and magical emanation, look after practitioners like a mother her child. Akasamadasa samaraya pe tayata om gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhi soham. For the teachings of the three supreme jewels possessing the power of truth, may all inner and outer hindrances be transformed. May they be dispelled. May they be pacified. Shantam kore soham. May all negative forces opposed to Dharma be completely pacified. May all the host of 80,000 obstacles be pacified. May we be separated from problems and harmful conditions to Dharma. May all enjoyments be in accord with the Dharma. And may there be auspiciousness and perfect happiness here right now. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this is a Buddha field and offer it. Thus may all sentient beings enjoy pure land, this pure land. O holy and perfect, pure Lama from the clouds of compassion that form the skies of your Dhammakaya wisdom, please release a rain of vast and profound Dharma, precisely in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. Idam kuhurata mandala kamaryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. That the merits I create through teaching the Dharma may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits I create through teaching the Dharma may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits I create through listening or teaching the Dharma may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Okay, so now again, let's begin to sit quietly for a few minutes and then we can start with the presentation. Okay, so welcome back everybody to day 2 of our teachings. So I think maybe I'll just review a little bit what we talked about yesterday, and especially in terms of yesterday morning. I think probably a lot of you missed a lot of what I said. It sounds like it was quite choppy, and even when I was actually logged in, the sound was not very good. So it might be good if I give a bit of an overview of what I was saying, because I think some people might have misunderstood what I was trying to say. I started the talk by mentioning that this text that Nagarjuna composed, the 60 stanzas on reasoning, essentially the thrust of this text is to show that in order to even achieve liberation as a hearer, as an arhat, one has to realize emptiness, and thereby to show that even in the first turning of the wheel, the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, that the Buddha was talking about emptiness, even though it was not obvious as it was in the second turning of the wheel on the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, and thereby to argue against the philosophers who would say that emptiness is a fabrication made by later philosophers, and it was not the teaching of the Buddha, to show that not only was it the teaching of the Buddha in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, but actually it was his original teaching. When the Buddha taught about cessation and nirvana, that he was talking about emptiness. And then I mentioned that Kedrip J, one of the main students of Tsongkhapa, then makes the point that when Nagarjuna and others are negating the philosophies of Hinayana philosophers, that the intention is not to say that Hinayana practitioners cannot achieve liberation. You have to make a distinction that there's the people who are making these philosophies and writing texts, such as the Vaibhashika philosopher Vasumitra, who I'll mention in today's talk, who Nagarjuna was specifically negating. But Hinayana practitioners, like in the sutras, we have the great practitioners, the students of the Buddha, Shariputra, Moggallana, and many, many others, who are said to achieve arhatship, and this is not being negated. The point here is that actually they were realizing emptiness, but that later commentators who tried to describe that realization in words were making wrong philosophies based on that. So then my purpose in then bringing up this topic of other religions, I think it may have been misunderstood that I was trying to say that emptiness is somehow taught in other religions, and I'm not trying to say that. From reading other religions, I think it's quite unique. The only other religious philosophy that I think might come close to emptiness, as I mentioned, was Adi Shankara's philosophy and Advaita Vedanta. It's at least the closest. And in terms of Western philosophers, I mentioned that the philosophies of Hume and Wittgenstein seem to have some correlation with emptiness, but that, as far as I know, those two philosophers were not yogis. They were not actually putting this into yogic practice or generating concentration. It was sort of an intellectual endeavor. But my purpose in mentioning other religion was to point out that, Lama Zopa Rinpoche also makes the point that even if somebody has a wrong philosophy of emptiness, they don't put it into words correctly, but still, due to their merit, they could have that realization. For the example, somebody like Milarepa, who doesn't study philosophy, but through incredible merit and devotion to his teacher is able to have realization of emptiness. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche was also talking about other philosophers before Tsongkhapa who erred in terms of making a philosophical presentation of emptiness, but still had some realization. So my point was that we look at other religions and we see that there are exceptional practitioners. I was not trying to say that ordinary people who practice Christianity or any other religion are comprehending emptiness, just like ordinary Buddhists aren't comprehending emptiness, but that there are certain exceptional people we can look at historically who seem to have had some kind of level of mystical experience, as they would describe it, or illumination, they might say. And I'm questioning what's happening in that case. Because my feeling is that something genuine is happening. I mentioned at the beginning of yesterday's talk that in Buddhism, we use Buddhism as a paradigm to understand the world. This is what any philosophy should be. It looks at all the evidence that's available and then comes up with a paradigm for understanding that helps us to put things together into a coherent picture of how things are. But if that paradigm thereby causes us to dismiss or ignore certain pieces of evidence because they don't fit into the paradigm, then that actually becomes counterproductive. This often happens in any discipline. In science, we see that, for example, in classical physics, there was a particular paradigm of reality, and for a period of time, some physicists refused to accept certain evidence that contradicted that paradigm, until finally a new paradigm came, that the quantum paradigm, that incorporated the new evidence in a coherent way. And likewise, some of you might have seen in other talks I've given, because I mention this quite frequently, we have a lot of evidence for things like we call psi, or clairvoyance, or other things like children recollecting past lives, or people having near-death experiences, which the evidence for these happenings seems to be quite strong. But a lot of mainstream scientific presentations reject this as fraudulent or otherwise mistaken because it doesn't fit into the paradigm. So I mention when I talk about that I think that a sign that it's just simply so as one of the great fathers of modern science, Francis Bacon, said, we should not narrow reality to fit into our view. We should expand our view to incorporate all of reality. So we can't just ignore or dismiss things because they don't fit into our picture of how things should be. So I think likewise with the Buddhist paradigm, if we say that only people who understand emptiness can be liberated, and then we see examples of great practitioners in other religions having these experiences, if we just say, well, they don't fit into our understanding of how spiritual practice works, so they must all be mistaken. Now, personally, I feel this is a mistake, that this doesn't look at what's really happening. But if we want to maintain the view that Nagarjuna makes a convincing argument for, that in order to have liberation, somebody has to realize emptiness, then they have to maybe have a possibility that people approaching things from a different paradigm, a different philosophy, could still be accessing, to at least to some extent, some of the same insights, simply based on the quality of their practice. And I gave the example first of Ramana Maharshi, who it seems probably just due to past inference, because he didn't really even do much practice in this life formally. He just had a spontaneous awakening as a young man. And then somebody like the Christian monk Thomas Merton, who trained for, I think, about 26 years as a Christian monk, and had become a very mature practitioner through that. And so it didn't take much for him to have some kind of realization. He just had to have a few conversations with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and then about a week later had some kind of insight into emptiness. So in some sense, his Christian background, his training, which had been quite intense as a Trappist monk, probably more intense than our training as Buddhist monks, actually, we look at the hardships they go through, had prepared him such that it didn't take much to have that realization. And then somebody like I mentioned, the Russian Saint Seraphim, who it seems to me, after 20 years training in the monastery and 30 years of intensive retreat in the wilderness, had some kind of what they call illumination. And I definitely don't want to dismiss that. As I said, I think especially the Eastern Orthodox Church seems to have a very strong tradition of practice, and it's something that I consider. But again, as I say, I don't have an answer for how we look at these things. And as I present Nagarjuna's text, of course, I will present it exactly as our Gaelic school interprets it. But I'm also open to the possibility that this is one way of seeing things, and there might be a deeper truth that personally I don't have access to, but I'm curious about that. So also, I talked yesterday about the beginning parts of the text, and I thought maybe there was a few points of philosophy that I expected as background, assumed as background, that maybe some people might not be familiar with, and especially the concept of what we call remainder and remainderless nirvana. So first of all, what is nirvana? So some of you might know we have the Four Noble Truths: the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering and the origin of suffering, then the truth of cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to that cessation. And so the cessation of suffering is what we call the abandonment. It's when through meditation on the path, then the afflictions in the mind, the wrong conceptions, are rooted out. They say from the very seed, the seed is destroyed. So the cessation is a mere negation. It's like when you're sick, then you become free of illness. So it's not that you gain something else, you simply no longer have the illness. It's the absence of something. So it said that the mind is now free of these afflictions. So it's understood in Nagarjuna's philosophy that cessation is actually an emptiness. It's the emptiness of the mind. The mind itself is empty of inherent existence. And at the moment that emptiness is obscured by our wrong conceptions, like similar to how a clouds obscure a sky. But when we abandon those wrong conceptions, then the emptiness just is already there. It's not achieving something new that we didn't have already. It's just removing the obscurations to that. So likewise, when the clouds are dispelled, the sky is just there. It doesn't have to be newly fabricated. But also in the early sutras, the Buddha talked about remainder and remainderless nirvana. And how that's understood in most philosophical schools of Buddhism is that when somebody first achieves nirvana, then they're what's called an arhat. This is not a Buddha. This is somebody who achieves, we say, a lower level of realization. But they had still achieved nirvana. But they achieved that in a human body. And so their human body still carries the potential for the physical experience of pain based on having been born through karma. So until they die, that is still remaining. It's something that's an obstruction. And the only way to be free of that is to die. Eventually they die, and then they're fully free of all suffering because their mind has already been purified. So the understanding is that when they die, then there's this remainderless nirvana. There's nothing left. But Nagarjuna is challenging that understanding. He's saying that there's a number of problems with that. One is that it implies that there's some kind of real thing that's then ceasing, that we have this real suffering body, and then that has to die in order to achieve a real nirvana. And he's also challenging the idea that implies that when the person dies, there's no person left, because the mind, the continuum of the mind ceases according to these schools, because there's no longer any propelling momentum for rebirth. So in that sense, there's nobody who achieved nirvana. There's nobody to say, I've done the work and I've achieved nirvana, because the person is gone. But then when the person is there, they haven't yet achieved this remainderless nirvana. So there's a problem in both ways. When the person is there, there's no nirvana. When the nirvana is there, there's no person. So it doesn't fit together. And also there's the problem of thereby being an end. You remember that I mentioned this point, that he says that the Buddha was clear, there's no beginning to samsara. So why should be this end when the body dies? He said, because in Nagarjuna's understanding, nirvana is something that transcends time. It's not within the concepts of now and then, after and before. But if in this lower system, it sounds as though it's saying, and right now I'm a contaminated person, and eventually I purify my mind, and then I die, my body ceases, and then there's nirvana. It's something that wasn't there before and is newly achieved. So in this system, it's understood that what remainderless nirvana has nothing to do with having a body or not. It has to do with having the appearance of true existence. Because a person, through meditation, what they're trying to abandon is the wrong conception of true existence. And when somebody achieves arhatship, they've abandoned that wrong conception. But because of the imprints of having conceived wrong of true existence for many lifetimes, then in post-meditative equipoise, their sense consciousness still has the appearance of true existence or inherent existence. They don't believe it. It's like somebody being in a dream who knows that they're dreaming, but it still appears that way. And this is an obstruction. It still prevents them from having a full picture of things as they are. And it said that an arhat has some level of clairvoyance, but their clairvoyance is limited compared to a Buddha, because they have like a lot of clouds in some sense, still obscuring the true nature of the mind. There's a different than the conception of true existence, because they no longer can be reborn through karma. They no longer experience suffering, but there's still some obscuration. When this person enters into meditative equipoise and perceives emptiness directly, there's no appearance of true existence, but there's no appearance of anything at all except emptiness. So they can't have this unobscured appearance at the same time as they're having the appearance of conventional existence, which means that they can't have the realization of a Buddha at this point. But when they're in meditative equipoise, still this is called remainderless nirvana, because there's no longer an appearance of true existence. The remainder being the appearance of true existence. And then finally, when somebody achieves full Buddhahood, they achieve what's called non-abiding nirvana, which means that they are still in this meditative equipoise, but they don't have to abide in it, meaning that they don't have to rest in it all the time. The Buddha can function in the world, but still have the mind in equipoise on emptiness without any appearance of true existence. And thus there is no longer any obscuration, and therefore there is full perception of all things as they are, without any overlay from past imprints. So this is what he was talking about in terms of this understanding of illusion. This is where we left off yesterday, that when we see things as an illusion, it's not a question of the illusion ending within the illusion. So like if we're having a dream, having a bad dream that I'm locked in prison, the solution isn't to find a door out of the prison. The solution is to wake up from the dream. If we have the conception that I'm going to do this and this and this thing within this space and time in which I'm experiencing things, it's still a conception of making nirvana a real thing that's external to me, that's too concrete or too objectified. So the understanding has to be rather to change the perspective through seeing the emptiness of true existence of all things. Then the illusion is just seen for what it is, and there's no longer a question, where did it come from, where is it going, because we know that it's an illusion. So with that, we'll come back now to the presentation. So you can open this all on your computers rather than having me share the screen. So yesterday we left off at slide 50, illustrating with an example. And again, if anybody is having any trouble loading this up or any other points right now before I move on, if you want to send it on the chat, otherwise I'll continue with the presentation. Okay, good. So yeah, I'll continue on now. So we were at slide 50, where we talked about illustrating with an example. Hold on a second. I'm just moving it so I can see you all, or I can see the chat. So if anyone has anything to say during the presentation, you can type it into the chat. So next, slide 51, we have the meaning of this example. So then we had the example of the illusion and understanding what is the purpose of this example. So those whose minds have seen the world like an illusion or mirage, they will not be polluted by views of extremes before. So here we have the pollution. We see that it's understood that these views we have, they pollute our minds. We start with the view of inherent existence, and then from that comes all kinds of other conceptions. From the view of inherent existence, then comes what we call wrongly applied attention, which really means making all kinds of conceptions about things that over and above what's actually there. So first we think that this is an inherently existent person before me, and then we generate attachment or aversion to that person based on our conceptions about them. This person is so attractive, or this person is so helpful to me, or this person, I can use them for this or this thing to get what I want. Or this person is ugly, or this person is a hindrance to me. I need to get rid of this person or obstruct this person. All kinds of thoughts that come. It's like pollution in the mind because it obscures seeing things how they are. It only sees things in relation to our conception of me and the world and how I exist and what I want and what I don't want. And then from that comes attachment and anger and all of the other negative emotions. And then from that comes actions that then create further cycling and samsara. But those people who have seen the world as like an illusion will not be polluted by these views of extremes, thinking that there's an inherent after and inherent before that don't exist in relation to each other. So it says that the first two lines show the realization, and then the second two lines show the benefits of that realization, that one is free of this pollution. And it's also, Gyaltsen points out here, also Chandrakirti in his commentary, that we have to make a clarification here. The two extremes here, absolutism and nihilism. That's one way to understand the two extremes. That's usually what we talk about when we say the two extremes. But here he's simply talking about views of after and before. So there was a previous limit to things. Things started at a certain point, and then a post limit or later limit after, which are related to absolutism and nihilism. Because if we think that an illusion is a real thing, we either ask, has this always existed, which would be absolutism, or does it only exist for a short time and then cease to exist? And this would be nihilism. Either case, it assumes that it's a real thing that we're seeing, and therefore it either exists in a solid way, or it doesn't exist at all, or it has only a limited existence. So the clarification that's being made here is that this understanding of things as like an illusion is how it's perceived in post-meditative equipoise. Because in meditative equipoise and emptiness, for a non-Buddha, for a sentient being, but it's still an Arya being, there's no appearance of anything except for emptiness. So things don't appear like an illusion. They just simply don't appear at all. But then during post-meditative equipoise, due to that realization of emptiness, then things appear illusion-like during the period after meditation. So now, the next slide, we actually move on to section 2. So yesterday, remember, we had the first presentation, which was talking about, in a general sense, about the dependent arising being free of two extremes, and showing that this is the teaching of the Buddha, that even in the Hinayana Sutras, this is what we mean by nirvana. So now actually a subsection of that within Gyaltsen commentary, but because it's such a large subsection, I've made it into a separate section here, is specifically negating the two extremes, which is what you have just asked me about, the negating the extremes of absolutism and nihilism, or as he presents it here, negating the extremes of birth and destruction. So first on slide 53 here, we have setting the context, stanza 18. Imputing on compounded things, birth and destruction, unwise ones, don't know migration like a wheel, the cycles of dependent birth. So here we have the wheel of life. Some of you might know this depiction of the samsaric existence, which we have the rim of the wheel depicts the 12 links of dependent origination, and then the hub of the wheel depicts the three poisonous minds of attachment, anger, and ignorance that fuel this cycling. So we see that existence is compared to a wheel. It cycles without any definite starting point or ending point. So Nagarjuna, in his text, the precious Garland, he also specifically says this, that we have the three main links on the wheel would be the afflictions and karma, and then the birth that's propelled by these. So all of these 12 links fit into those three. But these three don't occur in any definite order. Although ignorance is presented as the root cause, ignorance is fueled by birth, by being born into samsara and experiencing a life within samsara that only increases our ignorance. And then the karma also, karma is the cause of birth, but being born also causes us to create further karma. And having created karma, we have more obscurations, so then we have more ignorance. So there's not any particular starting point. It's interdependent, we say. So we see that within this stanza, Gyaltsab says that the first 2.5 lines, so imputing on compounded things up to don't know migration, or actually through unwise ones, because in the Tibetan, I think unwise ones would be in the 3rd line, that these show what an unwise person does, that they impute a starting point and an ending point within this never-ending cycle. And then the last part of the stanza shows then the faults of doing that, the drawbacks of doing that they don't know the cycle existence as it is, so they continue to cycle because they don't recognize it for what it is. So next we have verse 19, next slide, negating the extreme of birth. So birth can mean simply birth, like we have on the left side from a womb, like somebody actually being born, but also birth in the more general sense of production, things arising. So we have the birth of a sprout here, or just anything coming into existence. We have the conception that things didn't exist and then they come into existence, which comes from our grasping an inherent existence. It's although conceptually we might say, yes, I know that a sprout, it doesn't just pop out of nowhere, it comes from a seed, and that it comes from soil and sunshine and so forth. But still, the way we think about things, the way we talk about things, it's as if things have some kind of independent existence. There's this thing and that thing. This thing exists now and it didn't exist before, and it won't exist in the future. Which then it both comes from having a conception of things as not being interdependent, and also causes us to further grasp at them as not being interdependent. So if any of you were here for the last teaching on the 70 stanzas, you'll remember there was a very extensive negation of the extreme of birth, saying that if things really existed, were born in an inherent way, they would have to either be born from self, from other, for both, or from neither. Because if something exists in an inherent way, it has to be findable, has to be pinpointed. Okay, exactly where did this come from? This came from this other thing, or it came from itself. And we can pinpoint them as two separate things. But all of these run into various problems conceptually when we really try to pinpoint what something is. So this, as I mentioned also in that talk, that this has practical consequences. I gave the example of our president, Donald Trump, and I showed, comparing him to other news stories of this year, such as COVID-19 and wildfires in California, and pointing out that when people even see the picture of Donald Trump, some people might feel angry. But I don't think anyone feels angry at COVID-19 or angry at the wildfires. And I said, actually, some people might see those pictures and get angry at Donald Trump. So this shows that we somehow conceive of this person as being more inherently existent. We say, well, the COVID-19, there's nobody deciding I'm going to harm anybody. It's just a natural process. And similarly with the wildfires, it comes from climate change and other facilitating factors. It's not that the fire just suddenly pops out of nowhere thinking I'm going to come and burn people or burn people's homes. But then we see a person and we have this sense that this person is deciding, okay, I'm going to be an angry, ignorant person who harms people. But anybody who has anger and ignorance, that's coming from causes beyond their control, ultimately. It's coming from things that have to do with their upbringing, their biology, and in Buddhism, we understand it from their karma, but even the karma is not like an inherent person who incarnates. So, although we conceptually understand that, thinking about it, it doesn't always affect the way we conceive of things at an instinctual level. We think of it as this person and that person. This person is good, this person is bad, as though they arose from nowhere, in an inherent way. So this is the extreme of birth, that we think of things as existing in this fixed way. So here we have this stanza: arising due to this or that, a thing's not born as its own being. What isn't born as its own being, how can you say that it is born? So things arise due to causes and conditions that are not themselves, that are different from them. Now, some of you might have been confused last time when I talked about this birth from other, because we think conventionally, yes, things come from things that are other than them. However, they're not inherently other than them. If they were inherently other, that would mean they had no relation to them. So, a sprout comes from a seed, but if we actually had a time-lapse video of showing the seed gradually becoming a sprout, we couldn't agree on one particular point where, okay, now it's no longer a seed, now it's a sprout. It's a gradual process of change. Likewise, Nagarjuna gives the example of milk turning into yogurt. It's like if you put milk in the fridge overnight and it turns into yogurt in the morning, you say, yeah, last night it was milk and now it's yogurt. But if you stayed there all night and watched it, would you be able to pinpoint the point when okay, now it's no longer milk, now it's yogurt? And likewise, there's the example of how we use language as if things do not come from other. So there's the example of the man who says, I produced this boy. He points to his son, and he has this sense that this is my son. Even though Chandrakirti says he merely plants a seed, the man doesn't do a lot of work. It's really the mother who's giving the process of pregnancy and giving birth. The man is merely planting a seed, and he doesn't even have to have any interaction with the mother or the child after that. But still there's a sense that this is mine, this is an extension of me. And also in language that we say, I planted a tree. So we planted a seed, but we say I planted a tree as if it's already a tree when I'm putting it in the ground. So this shows that in our normal conceptions, we don't conceive as cause and effect as wholly other from each other. So things arise due to this or that. They arise due to causes and conditions. And it's not born as its own being. It's not just born independently of anything else. So how can you really ultimately apply the label born to it? So I'm just going to check. I see there's some things coming in on the chat, so I want to check this. So birth and death are just gross conventions of the human mind. That's not quite the case. Because conventionally, yes, things are born and die. We can say the baby was born, and that's correct. It's not correct to say I was born today. It's correct to say I was born 1982 when I was born. And conventionally somebody dies. It's not saying that when somebody dies, they're not really dead. But it's saying that ultimately when we try to pinpoint that and we try to find that as something existing, not in relation to something else, then we can't find it. And that actually our conception of it is as if it exists in relation to nothing else. So for example, with death, the death also exists in relation to a particular time. I talked about this a lot in the last talk, about the 70 stanzas, that we have a sense of time existing and passing in an inherent way. There's some kind of passage of time that exists beyond the people experiencing the passage of time. This has a very strong relation to classical physics versus relativity within physics. This is one of the great discoveries of the modern times, of Einstein specifically, that time only exists in relation to a particular observer. Although we might have this conception of it as time something that's just inherently passing all places in the same speed, it doesn't work that way. And likewise, in terms of the mind, because we're very attached to our current existence, we think that I am now this person now. Who I was in the past is gone. And that person is no longer existing. And then when I die, I'll be gone. I won't exist anymore. But all of these things are in relation to a particular reference point. And so because our mind is attached to reference points, we're then caught within that. And then we're caught within dichotomy. And then we have fear of death, and we have sadness when somebody we know dies, because our mind is still experiencing things within a relativistic framework. When somebody experiences emptiness, it's outside of that. There's no longer a sense of this or that, or the now and before and after. So we say conventions of the human mind. It's not just the human mind. It's any sentient being has these conceptions. The gross conceptions that we have as human beings that are unique, that animals don't have, are philosophically acquired views, where on the basis of this inherent grasping at reference points, then we start making philosophies. I mentioned yesterday about Descartes, the French philosopher, who, he experienced this sense of a self, which according to our Buddhist philosophy is a wrong conception, but he took this to be a correct perception, that this is the only thing that I know that I exist. And then on the basis of that, then he made an even stronger philosophy. This self of mine is permanent, it is partless, it is without causes. That is a gross conception that only a human has. An animal doesn't think I'm permanent, I'm partless. An animal just has an instinctive sense of me without having any reification on top of that. But in either case, these lead to experiences of suffering. So we have the negating the extreme of birth, and next comes negating the extreme of destruction. Exhaustion of the cause brings peace. Thus we think exhaustion, but things don't inherently exhaust. How can we say exhaustion here? So here we're talking about the opposite of birth, the extinction of things. And this particular verse, actually, Tsongkhapa cites this as one of his key verses in terms of understanding what we call disintegratedness. I talked about this also in the 70 Stanzas course. It's a very difficult concept, really. But Tsongkhapa considers this a key concept within Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti's philosophy, that the extinction of something or the exhaustion of something is itself a functioning thing. Because here we say exhaustion of the cause brings peace. So on the right side, we have the picture of a butter lamp. When the butter or the oil exhausts, then the lamp goes out. So the exhaustion or the cessation of the oil is a functioning thing that then causes the exhaustion or the cessation of the flame. So in other Buddhist philosophies, this cessation is a permanent thing. It's not a functioning thing because it's not something we can point to. We can point to a hammer and say that the hammer smashed the pot, and the hammer is a real thing that we can talk about. But when we say that the exhaustion of oil put out the flame, it's not talking about something functioning. It's just a conceptual idea. But according to this philosophy, everything that we talk about is essentially based on our conceptions of it. We can't pinpoint anything or find anything. The hammer is just as non-findable ultimately as the exhaustion of the oil. So in that sense, both of them can be talked about as functioning things, and both of them exist within a particular reference framework in a particular space and time. And so both of them are relative phenomena, and both of them are functioning things. So Tsongkhapa, actually, Chandrakirti himself, in his commentary to this verse, he gives two examples. He says, again, because Chandrakirti likes to use ordinary parlance, he likes to show how in worldly speech, if we look at the way we talk about things, actually, we do have this conception of the exhaustion of something as being a functioning thing. He gives the example, we say that there was no rain this year, so the crop failed. So the lack of rain caused the crop to fail. It wasn't that the rain caused it to grow, but then the lack of rain caused it to fail. So both of them are equal in being functioning things. And likewise, he gives the example of our food stores ran out, so my son died. So in that case, the exhaustion of food was the cause of death, just as the nourishment from the food could be the cause of life. So a negative thing, in the same way as a positive thing, is also a functioning thing conventionally. So, but when we search for it, we can't find it. We say exhaustion of the cause brings peace, thus we think exhaustion, but things don't inherently exhaust. There's no exhaustion except for the negation of something else that existed. The exhaustion of the oil doesn't exist independent of the oil itself. It's just a label that we give based on there not being oil anymore. But the understanding here is that this isn't just the case for negative phenomena. It's like anything else. The oil itself is just as much an imputed phenomenon. That we give the label oil independence on things that are not oil. We give it independence on the parts of the oil, which are we have the atomic structure, which is not itself oil, the molecular structure. We have the causes. We talk about when we have oil, it comes perhaps from vegetables, which are not themselves oil. And we have the mental imputation. We conceive of it in a particular way, as being a particular thing, which then has it function in a particular way in the world. So we think about this is how we say, this is fuel for a butter lamp, but somebody else might conceive of this as being something to eat. Somebody else might conceive of this as being, some kind of oil to use as lotion. It only exists in those ways based on our particular concepts of it. So just as much as exhaustion or the extinction of something is only based on concepts, likewise we say a physical thing itself only exists in a particular way based on concepts. So I have a couple of questions here. One is, what is the origin of mind? So that's a very good question, but it's a bit too complex right now. So I think please save it, and I will try to address that in one of the, in a later letter or at the end of the talk if there's time. And then don't get caught in concepts of birth or exhaustion as relative concepts. Essentially, yes. I mean, the basic point here is that things do arise and cease conventionally. But if we try to reify that, we have to be very careful. And this comes into specifically when we talk about nirvana, because this is what we're talking, the main subject of this text is about what is nirvana. And if we have the understanding of nirvana at the cessation of something that existed before, then it's only a relative phenomenon. And in that case, it's something that depends on other things, and thereby it's not really a true cessation of suffering. It's only something that it's a temporary non-manifestation of something due to the causes not being present. It's something that exists in a relative way within a framework of space and time. So therefore, it's a conditioned phenomenon, just like exhaustion of the oil. So if we have exhaustion of the oil, but we pour more oil in, then we can light the flame again. So likewise, if nirvana was simply that we run out of the misconceptions, but somebody can then just fill us with more misconceptions, we can again circle in samsara. But it's something different than that. This is what the understanding of nirvana as being kind of emptiness. So I'll move on to the next slide, the summary of just of those two verses. And so there's nothing born at all, and nothing at all that comes to cease. Again, this is talking about ultimately. Relatively, yes, but ultimately we can't pinpoint this thing exists now, it didn't exist before. This thing did exist before, but has ceased to exist now. So somebody might object to this, that if something has to be inherent, because when we make imputations, they have to be imputed upon something substantial. This is a good question that a lot of us might have. But the response here is that if something existed in a substantial way, then that would have to be the nature of that thing, and therefore it could never change. So if we have something like fire, we say that there's fire and this is inherently hot. But what is it that's hot and what is it that's fire? When we look at what fire is, the fire is combustion. That there's for example, wood, the molecules within the wood combust, and this releases heat energy. There's no fire beyond that. There's no fire beyond the release of the energy from the molecules. So if it was inherently that way, it would always have to be that way. It would have to be that there was always that heat there. So this is sometimes people might have the conception that somehow there's like this heat that's stored there waiting to manifest. But then this comes into conceptual problems. It's like if it's always there, so if the fire burns, where does the heat go? Does it go into the ashes? Does it go into the smoke? Does it go into the sky? So it only exists as heat in a relation to something else. It exists as heat in a relation to other things that are hot, to somebody experiencing the heat. So in that sense, there's nothing born, in the sense that it's not like something that was not there before just suddenly comes into existence, this fire, and then disappears and then goes nowhere. It only really exists in relation to other things. So next we have, next slide, which is slide 57. So this is actually a debate that somebody brings up, because now we have somebody might debate that, okay, you've just said that there's no birth and no destruction. But this contradicts the teachings of the Buddha, dispelling scriptural contradiction, because the Buddha said that things are impermanent and they arise and cease. So we have this quote from the Buddha: "Alas, compoundeds are impermanent, their natures to arise and then decay. Those things that do arise and then decay, the pacification of these is bliss." So we have here the Buddha very clearly saying things first arise and then they decay. And then the pacification of these, meaning essentially that when we pacify the afflictions in our mind, this is bliss. So isn't this contradictory to your saying that the Buddha was talking about no birth and no death when he taught the teachings? So the response to this is that this teaching is not definitive. This is only the Buddha talking in a conventional manner from the perspective of ordinary beings in a way that they can understand. It's a way of guiding them. So it's like if somebody is in a dream, if you immediately just say to them, "You're dreaming," they won't believe you, or they'll come to wrong conceptions about things. You first have to gain their trust and guide them step by step. So within the perspective of the world, things are born and they cease. Within our ordinary experience of time, things are born and they cease. So in this case, the Buddha is speaking from our perspective, but it's not how the Buddha himself experiences things. So this teaching on no birth and no death is the more subtle point. That's kind of a hidden, Nagarjuna would say, a hidden intention behind this teaching, that by hearing this teaching will be led to that. So the Nagarjuna says, the teaching, slide 58, "The paths of birth and of decay for sake of a purpose taught." So the Buddha taught this for a purpose, a higher purpose. Also, maybe it's an ulterior purpose. It wasn't taught for us to grasp at this as the inherent nature of things. And the purpose is this: by knowing birth, you'll know decay. So by hearing that things are born, you'll understand that they come from causes. And therefore, when those causes cease, those things will decay. So you'll understand that everything that is born must die. So by that, you'll know impermanence, because that which is the nature of destruction or decay is in the nature of impermanence. So we'll let go of our strong grasping to things as stable and solid. By knowing you're immersed in that, so knowing that you're immersed in this impermanence, this is the nature of your body, your mind, your existence, you'll soon know holy dharma too. And holy dharma means emptiness. That you'll come to see that things do not have this substantial independent existence that we impute to them, because even on a conventional level, they're constantly changing. We can't pinpoint them. We can't make them exist in a stable way as we want them to, or as we often conceive them to. So next slide, we have the benefits of realizing that, of realizing this emptiness. Dependent relative arising abandons both decay and birth. Those who know this cross the sea. Existence formed a wayward views. So you can see here again that Nagarjuna often uses dependent arising as a synonym for emptiness. Rather than saying those who know emptiness, he says those who know dependent arising. It's meant to be the same thing. It's just two ways of understanding the same point. Whatever is dependently arisen must be empty of inherent existence. And whatever is empty of inherent existence conventionally must be dependent on other things. It's not independent, because emptiness negates independence. Those who know this cross the sea. So we are trapped in this sea of wrong views. And that is with the sea of existence, of samsara. So this is how the benefit of understanding this. But next we have, next slide, those who strongly adhere don't realize this. So those who are blinded by ignorance. Most beings adhere to things as self, perverted towards non-being and being. Fault holds them in affliction's sway, and their own minds deceive them thus. So it's showing that because we conceive of things as inherently born and inherently dying, then we thereby create the causes for further samsara and continue to cycle in this space and time where we experience ourselves as born and dying and gaining things and losing them and suffering as a result. So in his commentary, Chandrakirti says here that we have karma and delusions. These are what fuels samsara. And we have a sense that there's a self that's separate from these. That there's an I that's creating karma, an I that has delusions. And we are afraid of emptiness. We are afraid of the emptiness of this I, so we cling to ideas of being and non-being. These are the perverted views that are talking about here, perverted toward non-being and being. And from these come the afflictions. So this fault of perverted views hold us in the sway of afflictions, or under the power of affliction. And our own minds then fuels our samsara. It deceives us and causes us to continue circling in samsara. So the next one is the opposite of that, how the wise and faithful ones realize this. Those wise toward things perceive all things, impermanent, deceptive, frail, as empty and as selfless too, as utterly bereft they see. So this is when we have wisdom. We see things as they really are. We see them, first of all, as impermanent. This is the first stage. And so in his commentary, Chandrakirti says, when we say impermanent, it means they're changing moment to moment. We don't see things as existing in an ecstatic way. And then it's deceptive because they appear as stable. They appear as having no relation to the experiencer. But that's a deceptive appearance. So they're illusion-like. And then frail. This word in Tibetan, it's sok. It could also be translated as hollow or flimsy. It's that things don't, they appear to exist in a solid way that it's like we can go out and touch them and they'll stand up to our analysis. But they're frail, and we see here, for example, in the top right, a picture of a frail bear. Bear is something that we often conceive of as being very strong and robust, but even these things are in the nature of decay and change. They're frail. As empty has to do with the way that phenomena lack self. That phenomena other than persons, the things that we perceive as object of our senses, they do not exist in a stable, independent way, independent of anything else. And then selfless has to do with the person itself, himself or herself that's experiencing that, is also without this self. And then finally, bereft is the result of that. It's that because they are empty of all these five things, they're impermanent, deceptive, frail, empty, selfless, they're utterly bereft of any kind of substantial existence. So next we have the next slide, slide 62, how the Acharya himself sees it. The Acharya here is referring to Nagarjuna. So this is how he perceives things. Without abode and not observed, rootless and they don't abide. From ignorance arise with force, without beginning, middle, or end. Like plantain trees without a heart, resembling a city of ghosts. Confusion's dreadful city where migrators like illusions dance. So here, the first two lines actually are referring to what we usually consider the four causes of something. In Buddhist philosophy, it's understood that things arise from different kinds of causes. So some of you might have a basic understanding of Buddhist psychology and philosophy. We have, we call actually conditions, often is the term that's used. We have the causal condition, the observed condition, the empowering condition, and the immediately preceding condition. So for example, with an eye consciousness, if I have my eye consciousness perceiving the color blue, if I look at the sky and I see blue, this experience of blue has to have various causes. It first of all has to have the empowering condition, which means my eye sense power. Without a functioning eye, I can't have eye consciousness. It's reliant on this empowering condition. So it's to repeat them. I'll go through them one at a time as I go through this. Next, we have what we call the observed object condition. This is the external thing that this light ray hits my eye. Without that, there can't be any experience of blue. And then we have the immediately preceding condition, which means the consciousness. This is something that's often overlooked in a lot of modern psychology and modern cognitive science. So it's understood that the consciousness, it's not really talked about how this comes about, but here in Buddhist philosophy, it's understood that their consciousness is the immediately preceding condition that has to be there. If there's no preceding moment of consciousness, there could be a continuity of that. So these three things together, the consciousness, and then the I, and then the external thing, come together to form the experience of the color blue. And then we have what's called, I said, the causal condition, which in this case is not in a sense something separate from those three. In certain presentations, it's considered something separate when we talk about karma, but I won't get into it too much. So I'll repeat them: causal condition, observed object condition, empowering condition, and immediately preceding condition. So here, when we say without abode, this is saying that things do not have the causal condition. The empowering condition is not inherently existent. The empowering condition being the I, which is the abode of I consciousness. Not observed, meaning the observed condition. So the sky or the color, the external light ray, doesn't exist independently of anything else or from its own side. Rootless has to do with the immediately preceding condition. So because that's the root of something. It's the substantial cause, the preceding moment of mind. And in Chandrakirti's philosophy, which is different than other philosophies some of you might have heard, even physical things have an immediately preceding condition. So if you have a pot, the clay that makes the pot is the immediately preceding condition because it's the root of the pot. It's the substantial thing that becomes the pot. And they don't abide. And this was talking then about the causal condition. So things, when these conditions manifest, things exist. We can talk about them, but when these things don't manifest, they aren't there. So in this sense, they're without abode and not observed and rootless, because they actually depend on other things that are beyond their control. When these conditions come together, that thing, we can say that thing exists. When these conditions no longer are fulfilled, then that thing will no longer be in existence. So from ignorance, they arise with force, meaning that although they abide, things, we experience things as in a forceful way. We are born into samsara through ignorance. And then we have this experience of things existing in this way, in a forceful way, without beginning, middle, or end. Again, as we talked about before, that this cycle just goes on and on. They appear to exist in a solid way based on our past conditioning with things. And say they don't abide also has to do with a particular philosophy that some people might have that is actually common within some of the lower schools of Buddhism, the understanding that something first comes into being, then it abides and it ceases, which is it is not compatible with impermanence. So we have the sense, I was born at such and such time. I exist now and I'll exist until I die, and then I die and then it's over. So it makes it seem as though as long as I exist in a solid way, as opposed to something changing moment by moment. So that way, when we have what we call coarse impermanence, the person who dies, then all of a sudden it seems like a shock. They were alive and now they're dead. When we don't recognize that there's this moment-to-moment change, and that what we call death is simply a continuity of that. It's nothing new, it's nothing different. It's just that the thing was always in a process of constant change. So then we have plantain trees without a heart. So some of you might know a plantain tree, like a banana tree. If you cut it open, there's no core to it. It's like an onion. An onion doesn't have a core. Like if you have something like a peach, you pull off the outer layers and you get to this core, but an onion is just one layer after another and then there's nothing there. It's likewise with a plantain tree. You pull off all the leaves and under that there's nothing else there. And it's like a city of ghosts. It's something that appears substantial. Actually, the word he uses in Sanskrit is Gandharva, which can also mean like a celestial musician kind of. Also can also have the connotation of a bardo being. But I thought the word ghost would just be more familiar to most people. It's just a kind of being that exists without a coarse physical body. So confusion's dreadful city. This is the city of samsara. And dreadful is the translation of a word that mizepa in Tibetan, which can mean like unbearable, which is very difficult to deal with. And also some alternate translations have it as the very closely related word mizeba, which just means inexhaustible. It just goes on and on and on without completing. You just circle in this cycle of samsara. So there's a question here about, please explain the three absurdities mentioned in the Madhyamaka Avatara. I think it's better, again, that's something I can do in later in writing, because it'll be a little bit too complex for the current topic, but please keep that question and I can try to deal with that later. Also, please just, if you can, reference, I think I know what you mean, but maybe be a little more clear when you ask the question, what number verse that is, because I think I know what three absurdities you're talking about, but just make it clear, a little clearer, and I can specifically answer that. So the next one, slide 63, which is verses 28 and 29, support for that, meaning that to support this contention that things don't exist in a inherent way. So first, within this world, what forcefully appears as true to Brahma and such, to Aryas, it said they're false. Except for this, what else is left? The worldly blind with ignorance, who follow after craving stream, and holy wise ones craving free. How possibly could they compare? So this first verse, it's talking about the god Brahma, the Vedic god Brahma. So actually, it's a little ambiguous. It could either be read as what forcefully appear as true to Brahma, or Brahma who appears as true to ordinary beings. But in either case, it can be understood to mean that beings with ignorance, because Brahma in Buddhist philosophy is understood to still be a samsaric being. So it's saying that even the supreme being, who's renowned as the supreme being in the world, still has this appearance of true existence. But to Arya beings, those who have seen the truth, they see things as false. So even though the one with the supreme wisdom eye in the world, even what he sees is false. So what else is left? Or it could be that Brahma, who was renowned as being this supreme being beyond sense consciousness, this ultimate, as it's presented in some of the traditional Vedic texts as this ultimate principle behind everything else. Even if that is false, what else is left? There's nothing that we can pinpoint as existing in a solid, findable, inherent way. And then likewise, the worldly blind with ignorance, so Brahma is included in this. Brahma is still blind with ignorance, who follow after craving stream, meaning that there's the force, the momentum from their previous craving through past lives, and they keep following that. And then the holy wise ones who see things as they are free of this craving. So how could we compare them? How could we say that Brahma, even the great God Brahma, can compare to an Arya being who sees things as they are? So it's saying if they were equal, so how could they compare? But if they were equal, then we'd have to say that the Buddha is just the same as sentient beings. But they are not equal. That one of them sees things much more clearly than the other one. So if Nagarjuna is saying, I see these things in this way, as frail, as deceptive, that's in contrast to how ordinary beings experience them, as stable. So next we have section 3, establishing that teaching the aggregates and so forth is interpretive. So now, up till now, we've had negating the two extremes of absolutism or of inherent existence, and the extreme of nihilism, of things being completely non-existent and no cause and effect. So now it moves on from that discussion to by say that when the Buddha taught about all these things, because Nagarjuna is saying when the Buddha taught the first turning of the wheel and the Four Noble Truths, he was actually talking about emptiness. But even though he seemed to teach about the aggregates and so forth, which means the aggregates, the 5 aggregates that constitute a person, and then we call the 12 sense spheres, which has to do with the various sense powers and the external objects. And then we have the 18 constituents, which means has both the consciousness and the sense powers and the objects. There are just different ways of conceiving of existence. That's very common in Hinayana philosophy. And it's very much what the Buddha was talking about in the first turning of the wheel. But it's understood here that this was an interpretive teaching. This was not the final teaching. So he was actually meant to be, the definitive teaching was emptiness. This teaching on the aggregates and so forth was not the way that it appears to the Buddha himself. We alluded to that before in some of the earlier verses, but now specifically this is the topic that Nagarjuna will talk about. So we have slide 65, verse 30, stages of teaching suchness. To those seeking suchness, first of all, to them say everything exists. Later, when they know these things without attachment, teach the void. So this, some of you might remember, if you were here for my 70 stanzas teaching, I quoted this in the next verse. And I quoted this verse in the context of the conclusion to the teaching, because I was saying that I just gave in this teaching on emptiness, which was quite difficult, and that for many people, this might be a little bit too much to take on, that the Buddha's teachings are arranged stages. And early on, if we immediately try to meditate on emptiness, it can actually be destructive, because we come to the conclusion that nothing exists and there's no point in doing anything or in creating good karma, or generating compassion or more concrete things that we can experience day to day. And actually, it seems a bit ironic, we take the Bodhisattva vow. One of the vows is not to teach emptiness to people who are untrained. And so since I don't know most of the people in the audience, it's hard to say whether I'm teaching it to the right people. But I think, this is more something that we can use our own judgment. We might listen to a teaching on emptiness and to get a good kind of a conceptual idea of what we're trying to achieve through this practice. But in terms of day-to-day practice, we have to really be grounded in the more fundamental teachings of the Buddha, which I mentioned in that talk, were the 3 higher trainings in the practices of ethical discipline and concentration and insight. And insight doesn't just mean insight in emptiness, it also means insight simply into our afflictions and the way that we behave day to day. So to somebody who's seeking suchness, who wants to understand the profound, first of all, say everything exists. Talk to them about the conventional nature of things and how there's karma and reincarnation and how our actions will have results in the future and how our psychology functions. So we have the picture here on the left of the Buddha giving his first teaching on the Four Noble Truths to the 5 disciples. So for a particular person, for your own practice, you have to be realistic about where you are and where you want to start with your practice. It's really important to have a good grounding. And even if you study emptiness, we're studying emptiness in the monastery. I think it's an important point to mention that, we are in a 4-year course of study now of emptiness. But even then, we spent 10 years in the monastery first studying other topics. And even within this presentation of emptiness, we're constantly making digressions into the more fundamental teachings on the nature of suffering and impermanence. In a lot of ways, there's more of that than there is on emptiness. And certainly, even for our own practice, this isn't like all we think about is emptiness. Day to day, my main practice is thinking about my monastic vows and how to behave as a monk. And for anybody else who has particular vows, either as a monk or a layperson, this is a fundamental practice. But over time, through practicing this way for a long time, gradually our attachment will lessen. So it says later, then when they know these things without attachment, when we start having less attachment to things and start having some experiential understanding of impermanence, then it's time to start teaching about voidness. So on the right side, we have the picture again of Vulture's Peak, where the Buddha then taught the second wheel, where when the certain select disciples were ready, he taught about this deeper teaching about voidness. So also in Chandakirti, he mentions that in the commentary, one of the fundamental teachings also is that it takes a lot of effort to move forward on the spiritual path. And it's quite effortless to go backwards because our habituation is to attachment. So this is an important point also, that when we hear about everything is empty, it can sound like, oh, we just need to relax and not do anything, not make any effort, just relax into the nature of the mind, which can be a major obstacle to really making progress. So initially the Buddha said, you have to make a lot of effort and work hard on this path. So in the next slide, verse 31, slide 66, we have the faults of wavering from that. So those who don't realize the void, engaging in mere scholarship, but not creating merit, these ones, the worst of beings, destroy themselves. So here we have a picture of somebody study burnout. If we just think about this over and over again about emptiness without grounding this in a practice, a personal practice of meditation and a personal practice of ethical discipline, then it just becomes mere scholarship, and it can actually be counterproductive and even dangerous. It says not creating merit. So again, I quoted this in the last talk, in the 70 Stanzas talk, to make the point of how important merit is. And I talked about this in the introduction here too, that Lama Zopa Rinpoche is saying that for realizing emptiness, really the most important factor is merit. If we just think that by thinking about it again and again, it's suddenly going to click and I'll be free of all my suffering, this is a misconception. We have to have a very strong collection of merit, which comes from practicing virtue, having a correct relation with the spiritual teacher, and doing various kinds of meditations that train our minds such that we can accumulate merit. And in that context, I actually gave the example, some of you might remember, I had the pictures of these German philosophers of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, as examples of people who, from my reading of them, had some understanding of the Buddhist concept of emptiness. And actually, both of them had read some Buddhist texts, but who fell into the extreme of nihilism based on that, and thereby, we say, destroyed themselves. I think in their particular case, in both of those people, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, were both very unhappy people. And Nietzsche especially had a very miserable life, a very lonely life, and spent the last 12 years of his life, insane. It's hard to say exactly why. It may have had some biological factors too. It's not really clear. But it almost seems like the natural extension. If we read any of Nietzsche's work and then start reading some of the things he wrote after he went insane, it just seems like it's just a logical extension, taken to the extreme of some of his ideas from before that. But even more than that, Nietzsche's work has been very influential in the 20th century among some people, like the dictators Mussolini and Hitler, who took what they understood of Nietzsche's philosophy and again took it to an extreme, and thereby abandoned any sense of morality, in sense that Hitler felt quite justified in doing what he was doing, because he was taking the idea that there isn't this inherent moral system. There's nothing inherently wrong about doing this. It just has, Nietzsche's philosophy was basically that right and wrong are only in relation to who's making the rules and who's in power. The more powerful person has the power to thereby create a system of what's considered good and bad and what has value. This is a bit of misinterpretation of emptiness. It's easy to see how we can fall into this trap, and therefore, this is why it's said that there's the faults of wavering from that. Wavering from that means wavering from this stepwise approach to things. Whereas rather than being grounded in practice, being grounded in ethical discipline, we simply take the teaching on emptiness as an intellectual guide, and then create a philosophy and act on that without creating merit, engaging in mere scholarship. So this is why we say the Buddha, and we go to the next slide, how to avoid such faults, why he taught in the order that he did. So first he taught authentically migrators, karma, and results. To know their nature totally, it's non-production, then he taught. So first of all, the Buddha taught that there are migrators, there are beings who circle through samsara, and there is karma, and there is the results of karma. And authentically, that it wasn't just something he was saying, it's authentic, it's true on a conventional level. This is more true than saying that suffering arises from some other cause. It's true to say that suffering arises from actions in past lives and from delusions. It's untrue to say that suffering is causeless, that we just appear randomly and that there's no meaning in the universe, that everything is physical and there's no mind apart from the body. In Buddhism, that's an incorrect view. It's a correct view to understand this cycle of existence. But then at a deeper level, to know their nature totally, it's non-production, then later the Buddha taught in the second turning of the wheel. But also even in the first turning of the wheel, this teaching was there for those who were ready to hear it. It just wasn't taught very clearly because some people might not have been ready for it. The next slide we have an interpretive teaching, verse 33. Just as for a purpose's sake, the victor spoke of I and mine, just so he taught of aggregates, constituents, and sense bases. So this is then pointing out to the Hinayana philosophers who say that, well, the Buddha said these things, so he must have meant them in a real sense. But even the Buddha taught of I and mine. So the Hinayana philosophers understand that the Buddha did not have a concept of an inherent self. He didn't think of himself as a substantially existent person. Yet, in the convention of the world, he taught I and mine. He said, I have become enlightened. I am teaching the Dharma. He said to his attendant Ananda, "I am tired. I need to lie down. Please bring food to me." He used the pronoun I. But this was only in conventional sense, and they understand this. The Hinayana philosophers agree the Buddha was only saying this because if he didn't use the term I, it would be very hard to communicate anything. So Nagarjuna is saying, in the same way, he taught of aggregates and constituents and sense species, only on a conventional level. It wasn't the ultimate truth. It wasn't how he experienced it himself. He was only teaching in a convention, in relation to the conventions of the world. So it said the purpose of teaching this way was actually to help people realize non-production. He taught that things are born and die in order to help people eventually come to the level of understanding no birth and no death, beyond that, the conventional appearance. So next we have corroboration by reasoning. So not only can we prove it using scripture, but by reasoning we can understand how things are dependent and not inherent. So we have verse 34. He spoke of elements and such encompassed within consciousness. By knowing that, they disappear. So aren't they wrong, imputed things? So here we have that the Buddha spoke about how elements, meaning, again, the things that arise in the world. Elements specifically here means, in the traditional Indian enumeration, earth, water, fire, wind. But really it just means the elements that compose the physical world. But they're encompassed within consciousness, or it can also mean that they dissolve or they disappear, and they go back into consciousness. Like they arise from consciousness, they emerge from consciousness and dissolve back into consciousness. And then by knowing that, they disappear. By knowing them as encompassed within consciousness, then they no longer appear. This is talking about the realization of emptiness. When somebody has a realization of emptiness, then there's no longer appearance of these conventionalities. So aren't they wrong, imputed things means that if when we examine their nature, they no longer can then withstand analysis and we can't find them, so they must have been wrong to begin with. It's not like, this is often pointed out, like in Chandrakirti's system, that it's not like the realization of emptiness destroys things. It only discovers that they never existed in the first place. So they must have been wrong, imputed things. They must have been just merely imputed by mind. Now, what does it mean to be encompassed within consciousness? This is actually a controversial question of this particular verse. And we see here on the right, Shantarakshita, who was a great Madhyamaka philosopher and interpreter of Nagarjuna, who was the founder of what we call the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka school, which means that he took elements of the mind-only system, the system that all physical things ultimately are manifestations of mind and don't exist substantially apart from mind. When we have an experience, for example, of seeing something, our eye consciousness is not substantially different from what we're seeing. We experience them as two separate things based on imprints, but actually the thing we're experiencing itself is a ripening of an imprint. It's not like you have the color blue externally that then hits your eye and then you have an eye consciousness. It's actually that there's one cause, which is a seed on the consciousness, which then ripens as two things: the internal eye consciousness, the external color. They only exist in relation to that original cause in the mind. So Shantaraksita, he believed that conventionally this is what happens. Ultimately, things are non-inherently existent, or at least non-truly existent is the term he used. So his understanding was that within Nagarjuna's philosophy, it combines both this middle way rejection of inherent or true existence, and also the mind-only school rejecting on the conventional level that there's any external kind of form. And he specifically quotes this verse in his text, the ornament for the middle way. Shantarakshita actually quotes this particular verse and says that this shows that Nagarjuna also accepted things as not being externally established. But other Madhyamaka philosophers disagree with that. Chandrakirti specifically says this is not what Nagarjuna meant. Nagarjuna was not saying that things exist only as mind on the conventional level. Because if you think that, then that gives too much ontological status to the mind. It still makes it sound as though mind is some kind of inherent thing that doesn't exist in dependence on something else. Mind and objects of mind are both dependent on each other. One cannot exist without the other. So in that sense, there is not externally established things that can be found under analysis, but there's also no internally established mind that can be found under analysis. They're both illusion-like. So then encompassed within consciousness simply means that things exist in dependence on consciousness. They exist in dependence on an imputer, but it doesn't mean that they're substantially one with consciousness. It's a slightly different way of understanding this verse. Because Chandrakirti says that if there was an inner mind without an external world, then they couldn't even talk about an inner mind, because the term inner and outer, the term inner only exists in a relation to something that's external. If there was nothing external, there would be no meaning in talking about an internal experience. So next we have the scriptural corroboration. So showing that the Buddha in the first turning of the wheel, this is slide 70, it's clear that he was talking about things not existing in an inherent way. So he says, when all the conquerors have said that only this nirvana is true, then who among the wise would think the rest of things aren't counterfeit? So here we have a teaching within the first turning of the wheel, where the Buddha said, and Chandrakirti quotes this verse from the first turning of the wheel, Bhikshus, the highest truth is singular. What is it? It is the non-deceiving thing, nirvana. All compounded things are deceitful. So the Buddha is saying that among the Four Noble Truths, we have the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, truth of cessation of suffering, the truth of the path. Only the third noble truth is the ultimate truth. The other three only exist conventionally. Only this nirvana is true. So if he's saying that, then wouldn't it imply that everything else is false? How can you say, because these Hinayana philosophers say that things exist truly, physical forms are truly existent, and atomically established, the atoms are truly findable under analysis. But why would the Buddha have said that only nirvana is true and compounded things are false? So who among the wise would think that the rest of things aren't counterfeit? Counterfeit, that they're false, that when we examine them, they don't exist in the way they appear to us. So next, we have verse 36, slide 71, showing that non-production is the actual meaning. Since it appears to ignorance, it lacks inherence. So as long as your mind fluctuates, till then you're under Mara's scope. If that's the case, then how could this, being free of fault, be incorrect? So it's saying as long as your mind fluctuates means as long as you're under the power of wrong attention, meaning that we have the misconceptions of what is unclean as being clean. We have the misconception of what is impermanent as being permanent. We have the misconception of what is in the nature of suffering to be the cause of happiness. And we have the misconception of what is actually selfless to have a solid self. So your mind is fluctuating. Your mind is under that power. Till then, you're under Mara's scope. So many of you might know the traditional Buddhist demon, Mara. We have in the picture here, the Mara appearing to Buddha on the night of his enlightenment, trying to tempt him away from enlightenment. And Mara has a lot of different meanings within Buddhist philosophy. It can mean Mara can refer to the afflictions of mind. It can refer to our aggregates of body and mind. It can refer to death, the process of continually experiencing death within samsara. And Mara can also refer to other beings, actually what's called the Devaputra, the son of the gods. It's almost like we have Cupid in the Western mythology, like some kind of tempter that causes a desire to arise in our minds. And it's understood that as long as our minds are deluded, then we are still subject to this, that we can still be influenced by spirits that can cause disturbances in our minds. So till then, you're under Mara's scope. So if that being the case, if your mind is deluded, then how could this being free of fault be incorrect? And what is this? So there's different ways to interpret that, actually. In his translation of this text that you have, that I gave to you, Thupten Jinpa implies that this refers to dependent origination. How can dependent origination be wrong? It's being free of fault being correct, meaning it's correct, right? It's free of fault, it's true. But actually, Gyaltsev J in his commentary implies that it means the direct realization of non-production. So it's understanding dependent origination as being empty. Because dependent origination, especially the 12 links of dependent origination, are coming from this fluctuating mind that causes us to circle in samsara. So fluctuate means that the mind is attaching to things. Or are under the power of our experience. It's like we don't have any kind of center. We just circle again and again. When things go well in our life, we're happy. When things go badly, we're sad, because our mind is attached to the fluctuations of appearance. So that is without essence, but we don't see it that way. So this seeing this as essenceless, without essence, is contrary to our deluded experience of it. So if it's contrary to our deluded experience, it must be correct, because our ordinary experience is incorrect, it's deluded. So it must be correct that things are empty of inherent existence. So basically, to sum up this verse, it's just saying that you Hinayana philosophers, you accept that ordinary beings are ignorant. So how can you possibly be saying that the way ordinary beings experience things is the way they are? That how can it be wrong to say that our ordinary experience is deluded and that things don't exist as they appear to us, if you already accept that we're circling samsara and we don't see things as they are? So again, the purpose of all of these verses that we've been going through is to prove to the Hinayana philosophers that that things don't exist in an inherent true way. That this is exactly what the Buddha was getting at. That if you think that the Buddha was saying things are real, and there's a real person circling in samsara, you're missing the point of his teaching. So next we have verse 37, stanza 7, slide 72. The existence of the world depends on ignorance. Because the perfect Buddha taught this world is caused by ignorance, so why should it be incorrect to say this world is made by thought? So we all accept the 12 links of dependent origination, the first of which is ignorance. We all accept that thereby things arise from ignorance. If we're Buddhists, we accept that. So then if that first link, ignorance, is a conceptual consciousness, and that's the cause of samsara, and the world that we experience is the truth of suffering and is caused by our karma, then how is it wrong to say everything is made by thought? You Hinayana philosophers, you say that things are not merely imputed by thought, yet the world arises from ignorance. This seems to be contradictory, internal contradiction. This relates to, again, my last talk about the 70 stanzas, when I talked about karma, and how all Buddhist schools agree that on karma as the fundamental teaching of the Buddha, but they have different understandings of how that functions. And especially the mind-only school and the middle way school understand that this has to be implying that mind has some fundamental relation to the physical universe. If it didn't, there would be no way that karma could function. It would be like in classical physics, where everything is physical, and thereby there's no room for a non-physical mind, much less a non-physical mind that actually is like the painter that creates the painting of the world. How can this happen? So this is what essentially the mind-only school and the middle way school, their philosophy is trying to explain how mind relates to the physical world. So thereby it somehow must be made from thought. It's arising somehow from our conceptions of it. So next we have, next slide 73 is again a quote from the precious Garland. which again, Chandrakirti cites this quote to corroborate this, another quote from Nagarjuna. When something seeded false, how could its birth be true? So if ignorance is wrong, and ignorance is the cause of existence, then how can existence be truly existent if it's caused by a wrong conception of things? So next we have verse 38, slide 74. When ignorance stops, it disappears. So this is just the corollary of the last stanza. By terminating ignorance, these others too are caused to cease. So how won't it get clear that they're imagined by nescience alone? So by terminating the first link of the 12 links, the other ones, the link 2 through 12, which is karma and the experience of birth and the experience of suffering, are also caused to cease by just as ignorance causes them, when ignorance ceases, they all cease. So why is it not clear that they are all imagined by nescience? Nescience means ignorance, it's non-knowing. Or another way to understand this, to translate this, would be, how is it not clear? Is how is it not become cleared away? So when ignorance is cleared away, they're all cleared away. So how can it be that we say that the world is real if when ignorance stops, the world stops? It implies that the world, the samsaric world, is an imagination of ignorance, because it exists. When ignorance is there, it comes about. When ignorance stops, it stops. It's like a dream. If you think that your dream is a real thing, why is it only there when you're sleeping? Why doesn't it just always exist, independent of whether you are dreaming or not? So the next verse, 39, which is slide 75. They depend on causes, so they lack inherence. What's born together with its cause, without conditions, doesn't stay. And with conditions gone, decays. How could you think this thing exists? So anything that exists, that's a compounded thing, depends upon causes that give rise to it and conditions to help it keep it functioning. When those conditions cease, that thing decays. So how can you think it exists in an inherent way? It's completely dependent on other things. So we can take the example of life. I had to be born from a mother. Without a mother, I would not exist. And then every day of my life, I have to be sustained by causes or conditions that are supporting me. Every moment, I have to be breathing air. I have to be eating food to sustain my body. I have to rely on all kinds of conditions that as soon as any of those conditions are gone, this life ceases. So how can we think of this life as existing in this solid, fixed way that doesn't depend on anything else? So next is stanza 40, and I'll stop here because we get now to section 4, faults of adhering to aggregates. So it's now what we'll talk about in the afternoon. The next section is what if things are inherently existent, is there anything wrong? Or if they're not inherently existent, is it simply a philosophical issue, or is there actually some harm to us by having this wrong conception? But for now, we have about 10-15 minutes left. So we can have a few questions. I'll check through the chat if there's anything I missed that I can address. Otherwise, if people have questions, please put them in the chat. I wonder, because we've had quite a good connection this morning, whether it would be possible to at least experiment with allowing people to ask questions without having to type them. Might be nice to try that and see. If people, when they want to ask questions, you can unmute yourself, put yourself on video, and we'll see if that works. If it crashes, then we'll have to try something else. So I also see this question about everything is a flow changing moment to moment, and the word moment is probably not a good one. So again, ultimately speaking, we can't pinpoint a moment, but conventionally, this is the way that we speak about things. We have to distinguish between conventional and ultimate reality. That any convention, the Buddha said, whatever the world considers true, I consider true. Basically meaning that the Buddha spoke in worldly conventions. And Chandrakirti very closely follows this, that what we consider conventionally true is whatever the world considers conventionally true. So conventionally, yes, there is moments of time. But when we try to pinpoint what is a moment, in my talk on the 70 stanzas, I gave the example of 4 o'clock. It's right now, say 4 o'clock in India. If I was on the planet Mars, what would that even mean? Let alone being in America where it's not 4 o'clock, but being on a different planet. How is there any reference point for saying it's 4 o'clock? This only exists in relation to a particular angle of the earth in relation to the sun, that we then impute the time 4 o'clock or 4 o'clock in 1 second, 2 seconds. These are things that exist only in dependence on other things. But conventionally, we can speak about it. I can say it took 5 seconds to do this thing. It's wrong to say it took 10 seconds on a conventional level. Yes, you have this thing about the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, and he taught that it's not to be identified. That's a very good point, actually. Some people might not know that. In the first turning of the wheel, when the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, he said specifically, he gave what's called the 3 repetitions or 3 proclamations. So he first said, this is suffering. This is the truth. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the path that leads to that cessation. And then in the second, this was called simply giving the nature, then explaining what they are. Then in the second stage, or the second proclamation, he then said what was called giving the tasks to be performed. Suffering is to be known. The origin is to be abandoned. The cessation is to be actualized, and the path is to be followed. And then in the third stage, he then said, although suffering has been known, there is nothing to be known. The origin has been abandoned, there's nothing to abandon. The cessation has been actualized, there's nothing to actualize. The path has been followed, there's nothing left to rely upon. So the conventional way of understanding this is that once you know suffering, there's nothing left to know. You've known all that needs to be known. Once you've abandoned the origin, there's nothing left to abandon. There's nothing, you've already abandoned what needs to be abandoned. However, a deeper way to understand this is that he's saying from the beginning, there's no inherent thing to know. There's no inherent thing to abandon. There's no inherent thing to actualize. So this is one way that Chandrakirti understands that in the first turn of the wheel, on an implicit level, or in a less than clear level, but something that was understood by the disciples at the time, the Buddha was talking about emptiness, even though to a lot of people, it doesn't appear that way. So, okay, were you about to ask a question, Nita?
No, that was my question.
Okay, okay.
So that was my question.
Okay, good. Okay. Is the mental image of a Buddha a permanent or an impermanent phenomena? I would say that it is impermanent because it is composed of parts, but I think that it is wrong. Okay, so that's actually a very good question. So first of all, when we talk about mental images, we probably mean what appears to our mind when we have conceptual consciousness. So like if I just imagine something, say I imagine, so we say the image of a Buddha, so I have this statue in the Sarajay temple, and I can imagine it now, I don't see it directly. What's appearing to my mind, we understand it as a meaning generality. It's not the actual statue, but it's a generality of that statue. And that generality is generality because it mixes time, place, and nature. So that statue that is in the Sarajay temple, it exists over a period of time. It was built, say, in 1972, and say it will disintegrate in 2050. But when I think about it, it doesn't appear to be changing moment to moment. It appears as a static thing. And I may have seen it over the course of many years, But what appears to my mind is a kind of a mixture of all of those. And also in terms of place. So this has to do that the statue that I see, it has many parts. It's composed of parts, as you say. It actually appears to my consciousness as though it's partless. Now that doesn't mean that it, like I think of the Buddha and he has two different hands, but conceptually, there's a sense that there's something over and above the parts, some kind of whole that exists independently of the parts. In that sense, it appears partless. This has to do with the way that we conceptually conceive of things. And mixing nature means that, for example, if I just think generally of a statue of the Buddha without thinking of the statue of the Buddha in the Sarajay temple, what appears is like a mixture of all the different statues of the Buddha I've seen. There's the Sarajay temple, the Saramay temple, the Drepung temple, the statue in Bodh Gaya. But I just think statue of Buddha in a general sense, it appears mixed in that way, like there's some kind of general statue of the Buddha. So in that sense, what's appearing to my mind appears permanent. It's an impermanent thing, but it appears to my mind as though it's permanent. That image is permanent. It doesn't change moment to moment. It appears to be static and partless, which has to do with the way that our thought consciousness distorts the way things exist. Now, there is a question of when somebody practices calm abiding meditation, because when we think about somebody meditating on the Buddha, they visualize the Buddha, they level their forehead and focus on that image. Is that a meaning generality or is that a functioning thing? And actually, I've tried to get some clarity on that, and I have different teachers that have said different things. And I think it's also something we have to test with our own experience. The general presentation I've heard from most teachers is that that's a mental image. That's a meaning generality. That you just focus on that meaning generality until it becomes a little more clear than it usually is. Because usually, if we think about things, it doesn't appear very clearly. But it appears more clearly that you can see it. But one other understanding of that is that when we have any kind of sense consciousness, there's an immediate, very short moment after that sense consciousness where there's an appearance to the mental consciousness of that visual or oral, whatever form. So we can just say with the eye, the visual form. So an example of this is if I look at something and then I close my eyes, you'll notice there's like an appearance of form very briefly. There's like the outline of the thing you saw. And that's actually appearing all the time to our mental consciousness, but we don't register it because it's too brief. And that is actually a direct mental perception. And one teacher, at least, this is recently when I was at Kopan in Nepal, I was speaking to him, and he said was of the opinion that when somebody practices calm abiding meditation, they're actually extending the duration of that appearance. So there's that very brief appearance after I look at the statue of the Buddha of a mental direct perception. And I'm holding that image in mind and extending it, the duration of it. So it's actually a direct mental perception that is an impermanent phenomenon. I hope that's not too complex. But generally speaking, yes, when we have a mental image, that's a permanent thing. It's a distortion. It appears distorted in a number of ways. It appears mixed in terms of time, place, and nature. It also appears as self. It appears as happiness. So depending on our conception of things, I have an appearance to my eye consciousness of a beautiful form. When I think about it, it appears attractive to my mind, which is again is a conceptual overlay. So our thought consciousness, although it's very useful and important, it also distorts things and doesn't see them exactly as they are. Now, this is something that's agreed upon not only by the middle way school, but also by the lower philosophical schools, the Hinayana schools, especially the Tantrika Dharmakirti, his presentation, he talks about this. The main distinction between that and then the higher Mahayana schools of mind only and Madhyamaka, middle way, is that in Dharmakirti's philosophy in Tantrika, that thought consciousness does not affect the way things appear to our sense consciousness. But in the middle way school and also in the mind only school, our conceptions of things are so strong that actually they appear to our sense consciousness also in a distorted way. This is a major distinction between the Mahayana schools, so that when I see a physical form, it actually appears to my consciousness and as an inherent thing, that it's not. There's some kind of appearance of permanence, even at the sense level, based on imprints on the mind from having conceived of it that way. Okay, so is emptiness just another word for expressing non-duality? Not quite, although it's related. It depends really what we mean by non-duality. Non-duality of what? And also emptiness of what? Different Buddhist schools use these terms in different ways. So for example, in the mind-only school, when they say non-duality, they mean that things do not, that the perceived object and the consciousness perceiving it do not exist in it substantially different. They're non-dual. That's not considered emptiness according to the middle way school. But in the middle way school, non-duality could mean freedom from the dualism of the extreme of permanence and the extreme of annihilation, and the middle way between that and emptiness. So in that sense, it does mean the same thing, but it really has to do with how we mean, what we mean by non-duality, free of what two extremes.
Venerable, I had a question. I typed it in there. In the four conditions, is the causal condition, does the causal condition cause the observed condition and the empowering condition?
No, it doesn't cause them. It depends on different presentations of it. But basically, in the normal presentation, the causal condition is not actually something different from those. The causal condition is simply a general statement referring to conditions. So all of those are actually causal conditions. It's just conceptually we can divide it, but those three are the main ones, and then they all are causal conditions. Now, I think that the reason that there's a fourth one is because in some early presentations, it was presented separately as something else. And I can't remember actually what they presented as separate, but in most of the presentations you'll read about in Buddhist philosophy, it's not something separate. It's just like a different name, but really there's only three conditions, and the causal condition is the general meaning for the condition of something.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay.
I have a question related to the yesterday.
Okay, yeah.
Because I totally agree with your vision of the presentation of the other religion, and I really like what you said about it. But I'm recently studying the precious human rebirth, and I cannot fit this vision, like open view, with the fact that it seems like when you state the precious human rebirth, it looks like you need to have is not precious if there is not the right view and meeting particularly the teaching of the Buddha.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I'm wondering, what does it mean that from other religion they don't have precious human rebirth?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think I tried to make clear at the beginning of this talk that I certainly I'm not trying to imply that Buddhist philosophy is not unique, that different religions are saying the same thing. I'm saying philosophically, they're saying different things. It's to say that there's reincarnation and that we have been born in previous lives. It's very different than saying we are created by God. And in Buddhist philosophy, the view of reincarnation is correct, and the view of creation by God is incorrect. My point was more to say that when people from other religions are having mystical experiences, the question is, what are they experiencing? And I think just simply to say that somebody is having a wrong view and they're experiencing a wrong consciousness, I don't think that measures up with looking at the evidence of what's happening. So I'm saying that in certain cases it may, and I'm not sure, but my hypothesis is that it may have to do with the merit of the person, that the person has very strong merit, and then they might have an experience of things in a more correct way. but even then, the conception of that experience is going to be filtered depending on the philosophy that the person has. And I said, for me personally, certainly Buddhist philosophy works best for me. But I think, that we live in a world where we have egalitarian views, which I think is a very good thing. In the ancient world, there was generally a sense among most cultures that our culture is right and other cultures are wrong. And that's still the case in a lot of cultures that are more traditional, that our way of doing things is the right one. And so I think we have to be careful of that, to be recognized that sometimes different ways of seeing things, it's not a matter of being right or wrong. It's a matter of something that's more helpful for a particular person in terms of leading to something that's even a deeper truth, that both of them are only provisional. But that doesn't mean that conventionally, yes, if I was to debate with somebody, I would debate, I believe in reincarnation, and I'll give reasons for that. And we debate against somebody who says that things are created by God. But I think, as I'm saying, that I think it's very useful to keep an open mind and not cling too much to, because when we see very clearly that other religions are very effective, not just at not just in terms of this very basic thing, okay, people who practice this religion are nice people, but we see that some people are really sincere practitioners. There are yogis and other traditions other than Buddhism who seem to have really achieved something. So it's an open question for me. Yeah. Okay, so you didn't understand about the fluctuation. Again, my point was simply that when it says the mind fluctuates, it's saying that basically the mind is under the power of afflictions. Our minds are not stable because we're constantly under the power of attachment and aversion, and attaching, based on our ignorance and our exaggerated perceptions of things. Then we chase after what we consider desirable, and then reject what we consider undesirable. But so our mind is fluctuating. It's not stable, and not able to be free of the power of afflictions. So I think maybe we can take a break now, because we'll have a shorter break today. It's already about 1:10 Indian time, and we're going to start again at 2:30 Indian time. So hope to see you all in the afternoon. Again, let's just make a very brief dedication in the morning, like we did yesterday, thinking about all the people suffering in the world. And then we can think about the purpose of these teachings on emptiness ultimately is to be able to benefit people, that we want to not only benefit them in a conventional way by giving people more medicine or food or whatever. That's also a good thing to do, but the ultimate way to benefit people is to understand the nature of existence, and all the causes that ultimately bring about this experience that we're having. We have to step back from the immediate effects and look at what's the evolutionary process that causes this all. And that's why we're talking about emptiness. So let's dedicate that we can all have some understanding of that in order to benefit others. So just pause for a moment for that dedication. Okay, so I'll see everyone at 2:30 Indian time.
Thank you.